Welcome to Digital Earth Academy Oceans. And first, we'd like to respectfully acknowledge that the Denver Museum of Nature and Science is on lands traditionally stewarded by the Ute Nation, the Arapaho Nation, and the Cheyenne Nation, and that lands all over the planet have been and continue to be stewarded by Indigenous people. Now, throughout the program today, there's a couple of ways you'll be able to interact with us. There will be a couple of polls where you'll get to help decide what we see next, and in the chat. But please only use the chats to answer questions that one of us has asked you, or to ask questions that you'd like us to address later. And as I mentioned, this program will be about 45 minutes, after which, if you need to leave, you can leave, that's fine. But if you'd like to stick around, we'll have some time for some questions and answers. And with that, I would love to introduce our host today, Bob Raynolds, who is a geologist and a world traveler who has been all over the world. And flying our satellite today is Asa. Take it away, Bob.
Thank you very much, Mitch, and welcome everybody to Digital Earth Academy. This is a program run through the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and we have had a variety of shows over the last few months, and it's an opportunity for us to share with you the world. And we're starting out with a view of the world that you can see on your screens. I hope that there's something that looks a little bit like a blueberry to me, but do you guys see a blue blob? And question is this a place that's familiar to you? It looks like a lot of water, and the blue color is water, and we are looking at the entire planet. And Asa is flying. We're using something called Open Space. It's put together by NASA, and it's been worked on by lots of different people, but it combines satellite images, pictures taken from space, and makes a view of the Earth. And this is a view of the Earth. And we're going to zoom in a little bit and see if there's something familiar in the middle of it. So we're sort of zooming in. You can see all that blue stuff is water. That's one of the larger oceans around on the world. And there's a little trail of stuff right there in the middle. And what do you guys think that is? What is that little trail right there in the middle of the screen? I'm looking at the chat. I'm trying to see if people are answering it. I'm seeing some excitement in the chat. And yes, you got to get right. These are the Hawaiian Islands. And the Hawaiian Islands are volcanoes, and they're sticking up from the bottom of an ocean. And let's see if you guys know which ocean this is. I think we've got a poll question coming up here. We can ask about the size of oceans. Let's see if there's a poll. So you guys can fill in the poll, and we'll see who knows which is the largest ocean on the surface of the Earth. And I'm not sure who's controlling the poll. If you're seeing the people answering the poll questions.
It's going great. We're getting a lot of votes.
Okay.
One ocean seems to be running away with it. We'll leave the poll up for a few more seconds.
Okay, well, very good. Everybody get a chance if you can put an answer in the poll, or just sort of think about what you think the right answer is. And we're about to reveal what the polling results. Oh, look at that. 86% of people think the Pacific is the largest, and that's right. And nobody voted for the Indian Ocean. Okay, so the question about the oceans on the planet is a very interesting one. It turns out that a larger portion of the surface of the Earth is covered by oceans than by land. Almost 3/4 of the world's surface is covered by ocean water. And the Pacific Ocean is the largest of all. And the floor of the Pacific Ocean is covered by volcanic rock. And some of the volcanoes actually stick up above the Earth, above the surface of the water. And the islands of Hawaii, which many of you recognize, are volcanic islands sticking up above the Pacific Ocean. Now, we're going to continue our view of oceans. And this class is going to be a little bit of a geography lesson, because we're going to not only look at where oceans are, we're going to describe their names, and also look at some of the smaller bodies of water that are called seas. And sea, that means S-E-A, not the letter C. So S-E-A, we're going to be looking at some seas as well as oceans. If we go to the east, we're crossing out of the Pacific Ocean, and you can see we're going to go across North America, and we're going to see the Gulf of Mexico right smack there in the middle. And then Asa, who's flying, is going to be moving the the daytime so that we can get daytime into the Atlantic Ocean. And there's a North Atlantic and a South Atlantic. So we're looking now at the North Atlantic, which separates North America from Africa and Europe. And the South Atlantic, which is down a little bit below, separates South America from Africa. So the Atlantic Ocean is technically one ocean, but it does have a northern and a southern part. So there's a North Atlantic and a South Atlantic. And then as we wander around, we're going to go up above Africa, and we're going to look at the, the body of water that separates Europe from Africa. And that's called the Mediterranean Sea. And it's not technically an ocean. The oceans are very, very big, and the seas are smaller. So this is the Mediterranean Sea. And some of you might know what Mediterranean means or stands for. And it's Medi means middle, and terrain means earth. Mediterranean is middle earth. And the Mediterranean Sea really was in the ancient times when people were navigating in the Mediterranean, it was sort of like the middle of everything, because you had Italy and Greece and Europe up on the north, and you had Egypt and North Africa, including Libya and Tunisia and Morocco on the south. And so the Mediterranean was sort of the middle of everything, Middle Earth. And it's separated from let's look at the Straits of Gibraltar there. That's where the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Oceans come together. And you can actually see across that. Gibraltar is on the left, and the northern part of Morocco is on the right. And if you stand at the edge of the North Africa, you can see the Rock of Gibraltar off on the horizon. It's a very narrow strait. It's Strait, Strait of Gibraltar. And the currents flow very rapidly through there. The waters from the Atlantic go into the Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar. So in the area around the Mediterranean Sea, there's other water bodies as well, and we can look at some of those. We'll sort of pull ourselves out. Again, Asa is flying open space. It's a NASA program, and we're looking at many satellite images that have been sort of composited together. And if you look now at this area, you'll see there's a variety of other bodies of water east of the Mediterranean, on the right-hand side of the Mediterranean. And just above the Mediterranean, there's some of you might know about Greece and Turkey. That's the countries that are there. And above Greece and Turkey, there's the Black Sea. And the Black Sea is a very deep body of water. It's got rivers that come into it. The upper part of the Black Sea is fresh water, and the lower part of the Black Sea is super salty. So there's a layered system in the Black Sea, and there's all kinds of preserved shipwrecks and things on the floor of the Black Sea. It's been navigated for thousands of years, and underwater archaeologists are working in the Black Sea right now, looking at old shipwrecks. And if we back out a little bit and go to the right, you'll see the Caspian Sea. So let's just scoot out. We're going to go across the countries of Georgia, which is a former part of the Soviet Union, and then there's the Caspian Sea. And Asa, while we're here, we might look at the Aral Sea, which is just up there. And the Aral Sea is a very interesting place. It's named the Aral Sea, and it used to be a place for big fishing operations. And then the water that was going into the Aral Sea was used for irrigation, and the water levels went way down. And right now you just see a few little bits of lakes there, but this used to be a great big body of water called the Aral Sea. And it's mostly dried out in the last 20 to 40 years. And right now, right there in the middle, there's sort of a ridge that used to be an island in the water of the Aral Sea. Now there's a little sea on the left and a little sea on the right. And so there are some dramatic changes that have taken place in historic times and in recent times, and it has to do with the way we use water. We're going to talk about that more as we go through this program. So this is the Aral Sea, and it's just a little set of lakes now, but it's still called a sea. So we're going to back up, and we're going to go back over towards the Mediterranean, and I want to introduce you to the Red Sea. And this is a body of water that separates Africa from the Arabian Peninsula. So we're going to keep backing out, and we're going to see again, we've got the Caspian Sea on the left, and then we're going to see a little bit of, we keep backing out here, there's the Persian Gulf, and there we go. Now you can see we've got Africa on the left. Let's go way back out, Asa, so that they can see the whole planet and get a sense of where we are. So just to make sure everybody's organized, we've got Africa on the left, and we've got the Arabian Peninsula right smack in the middle. And we're going to look at the Red Sea. So we're going to go down in there and look at the Red Sea. And the Red Sea is called the Red Sea because it has algal blooms every once in a while that turn the water actually reddish. But this is a very interesting small ocean or sea. And you can see that it sort of has the same shape on each side. It's what we say it's symmetrical. And it's because it's actually stretched apart. It's part of continental drift and plate tectonics have opened up the Red Sea in just the last few millions of years. It's a relatively young ocean. And it's splitting apart Africa on the left and the Arabian Peninsula on the right. So that's the Red Sea. Now, we're going to go up to the north end of the Red Sea. So you can see it's a long feature. It's just sort of spreading apart. And we've got the country of Sudan on the left. Saudi Arabia is on the right. There's a big river on the left-hand side. I think you can see the river. And some of you might put the name of that river in the chat if you know the name of that river. Does anybody know the name of that river? It's in Egypt. It's one of the longest rivers in the world. There you go. I see it coming in. Yeah, it's the Nile River. So the Nile River flows into the Mediterranean Sea. And we're going to go down and look at the little tiny body of water that's sort of on the right-hand side of the Mediterranean. And it's a very interesting place where there's super salty water. And it's called a sea, and it's very low. It's below sea level, and it's extremely salty. It's one of the saltiest bodies of water in the world, and it's coming right into view here. And it sort of separates the lands of Israel and Palestine on the left from the lands of Jordan on the right. And this is there you go. We're getting it in the chat. People recognizing it's the Dead Sea. And I've been to the Dead Sea, and it's super, super salty. When you go into the Dead Sea, you float very easily because it's so salty, but it's also very sort of sticky. And when you get out and the wind dries you, you get a sort of a crust of salt on. It's a little bit uncomfortable. And some of the places where you can go in have little showers so you can wash off the salt. But the Dead Sea, you can take a newspaper and lie on your back, and you float so high you can just read the newspaper. It's a wonderful place. And the water levels in the Dead Sea are actually starting to fall. You can see right on the peninsula in the foreground, things that look like bathtub rings, because the water level in the Dead Sea is going down. And why would the water level in the Dead Sea be going down? You can think about that for a minute. If you see those bathtub rings, it's just like if you got in the bathtub and you had a bubble bath or something, and then you let the water out, you might see little rings around the bathtub. And those are the rings you can see right around there on the edges of the Dead Sea. And the water is falling, the water level is falling because people are using the river water from the Jordan River for irrigation, and it's getting super hot in this area, so the water is evaporating. So between the water being used for irrigation and the water that's evaporating, the levels of the sea in the Dead Sea are going down. And that's a function of a little bit of global warming, climate change, but also the fact that we're using a lot of the water for growing crops and for irrigation. So beautiful views here on the edges of the Dead Sea. And I've been there, and you can walk right out into the edge of the water, and there's a salty crust all along the edge. It's sort of a gnarly place. There's also little mud pots, and people get into the mud pots and they put the mud on, and they think it's very good for your skin. So that's the Dead Sea muds. But the thing that's interesting about the temperature of this area, because it's quite warm, evaporation is taking place at a very great rate, and in fact the temperatures of the ocean vary according to where you are. And we've got a data set that comes from Science on a Sphere. Let's see if we can pull in our data set on Science on a Sphere that shows ocean currents. And we're going to sort of back out from the Dead Sea and switch our views here. And we're looking at a computer model, but the colors are the temperature of the water surface in the ocean. And I'm not sure if we can zoom in on this thing or not, but we can maybe look at focus on the Atlantic Sea, the Atlantic Oceans right in the middle of the screen. And you'll see that there's the reddish and orange colors are the warm waters, and the warm waters are circulating, and then they're moving up along the west side of the Atlantic Ocean, and they're going up along the east side of North America. And that's the Gulf Stream, which you might have heard about. It's a current in the ocean, and the oceans are colder in the north and warmer in the equatorial places. And you can see the waters are always moving. And this was a very important thing when you were sailing in a ship from North America back over to Europe. If you wanted to go to Europe, it was very important to get into the Gulf Stream because it made your trip faster, because you could actually travel in one of these currents that's moving the water in the ocean. And the other is true too. If you're coming from Europe heading towards North America in an old sailing ship, you didn't want to be in one of the currents that was moving against you. And so the old people who were sailing ships would test the temperatures of the water. And if you wanted to go fast heading from Europe to North America, you avoided the warm water because the warm water was flowing towards Europe. And if you were in North America and you wanted to get to Europe quickly, you got into the warmest water possible. And actually, Benjamin Franklin figured this out. So some of you remember Benjamin Franklin, and he traveled back and forth a lot between North America and Europe in sailing ships, and he figured out about the water temperature and the currents in the ocean. And you can see, if you look, it's like art. Almost anywhere you look in the oceans, there's this wonderful pattern of moving water that's associated with the flow of different temperature waters around the surface of the earth. It's a wonderful thing. So we're going to think about water and the temperature of the surface of the earth, and we need to think about how things are changing through time. And the earth is getting warmer, and the air is getting warmer. We can measure the temperature, but it's really interesting to note that a lot of the global warming that's been happening for the last 100 years or so has been warming the waters of the ocean. And we're going to do an experiment in just a moment. We're going to turn on an experiment, and Mitch and Asa are going to help us look at the effects of the heat capacity of water. And it's going to be an interesting experiment to discuss how the temperature, as the temperature of the earth is increasing, the temperature energy is largely going into the water of the earth. And let's see if we can play that the experimental video.
Let's do an awesome experiment about the heat capacity of water. Now, we did this experiment in a small way with a balloon and a candle, but now let's do it in a big way. For that, we're gonna need a big balloon. First, we blow up the balloon. Now that we have a bigger balloon, we need a more intense heat source. This is Doug with a propane torch, which is much hotter than our candle. Do you think our balloon will survive? No, it will not. Let's see that again in slow motion. Now let's see what happens if we put a little bit of water in our balloon. I'm not gonna fill it all the way with water because it would be too heavy to hold, but just a little bit of water and the rest filled with air. Now our giant balloon has a little bit of water in it. Let's see if that makes a difference. Now this torch is usually used to connect copper pipes together. It should be way too hot for our balloon to survive. But the little bit of water in there absorbs the heat and prevents it from getting hot enough for the balloon to pop. But what happens if we move the torch to an area of the balloon without water? Let's see that again in slow motion.
Well, thank you, Mitch and Asa, for putting that together, and thank the museum, the Denver Museum of Nature and Sciences facilities staff for organizing the blowtorch experiment. And the key point of that experiment is that the balloon, when it's filled with air, will pop immediately. But if you put water in it, the water absorbs the heat and dissipates the heat from the balloon, because the water has a very high heat capacity. It can hold a lot of temperature, and it does not, the surface of the balloon does not get hot enough to make it pop. And so that's what's happening today on the surface of the Earth. The water is slowly heating up. And that image that we saw a few minutes ago, the currents moving along the surface of the Earth, those currents are getting a little bit warmer as we move around on the surface of the Earth. But now we've talked a lot about the oceans. We're looking at the South Atlantic and the Atlantic. We saw the Pacific over there. The Southern Sea, let's just nip down to the south. We'll see the Southern Sea, which is well, let's see if we can rotate around just to introduce some of the other oceans. So you're looking at the North and South Atlantic. Now you're going to see the Indian Ocean as we come around on the other side of Africa. And the other oceans are the Southern Ocean down around Antarctica, and there's a polar sea up around the North Pole. So here's the Indian Ocean, which is the third largest ocean after the Atlantic and the Pacific. So let's go into the oceans. And you know, we've talked about where they are and what they look like, and we talked about some of the seas as well. But let's go into them, and let's ask a poll question here. And if we were to go into the oceans, what would you like to see? So if we went beneath the waters here, see what you'd like to see underneath the waters of the ocean. And we'll let you think a little bit about this. The Titanic is a giant shipwreck. There are underwater volcanoes that are active on the floor of the ocean. And then sometimes sharks get hungry. And you guys can vote for what you want to see as we're going to have some little videos that we can pull up. And we'll see what people would like to see beneath the seas. I think people are making their votes. Let's see what's coming up. There we go. I think a few more votes can come in. We'll get 1 or 2 more minutes. And if you can't make the poll work, just sort of raise your hand or think about which one you'd like to look at, and then we'll go look at it. So let's see the results of the poll. The Titanic is the winner. The Titanic is the winner. The underwater volcano comes in next, and the shark feeding frenzy is the least popular. Well, let's go look at the Titanic. The Titanic is a giant shipwreck in the North Atlantic Ocean. And you can see this is an underwater camera that was put down here. These images are coming to us courtesy of NOAA, who put them together. And you can see there are life rings there. And this is the deck on the top of the Titanic, which is down on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. Some of you might know that this was a beautiful big passenger ship, and it hit an iceberg and it sank. There's a bathtub on the top of the Titanic, and it's got all kinds of strange rust patterns in it. So we're going to also, since we've got the chance to do this, we're going to also look at some of the other choices, and we might back out now from the Titanic, and we're going to look at an underwater volcano. Let's see if we have the underwater volcano video. There you can see, this is on the sea floor, again, courtesy of NOAA. And it's astonishing to see the activity of volcanoes underneath the ocean. And it turns out that the floors of the ocean have lots of different volcanic areas, and there are many volcanoes that are active. And here was a situation where they got a camera down there, and they're witnessing a volcanic eruption on the floor of the ocean. And so this is underwater volcanic eruption. Astonishing to see. And there's red hot lava coming out. See the red hot lava coming out, and then steam and bubbles and debris. Very dramatic. And this underwater volcano is near the island of Samoa. It's in the Pacific Ocean. And then just for the few people who wanted to see the other feature on the floor of the sea, we're going to look at what happens when a dead fish falls to the bottom of the ocean. And here's a dead fish that's landed on the floor of the ocean, and a whole series of sharks have found it, and they're having their breakfast on the floor of the ocean. And it's like a marlin. So I think it's a marlin that died, fell to the bottom of the ocean, and these sharks are all having breakfast. So there you can see that there's life on the bottom of the sea. And I think that it's important to appreciate that the oceans have a huge amount of biodiversity. There's a wonderful variety of life in the oceans, and it ranges from super small things like plankton and algae all the way up to giant things like blue whales. And there's a whole food chain, different animals and different plants that live in the ocean, and the small ones are very widespread. And here we're coming down actually near the Great Barrier Reef. Somebody mentioned that in the chat. The Great Barrier Reef is on the east side of Australia, and the reefs are extremely valuable places in the oceans. They're places where lots of different kinds of animals live, and there you can see the shallow. As we zoom into eastern Australia, you'll see the little offshore islands are parts of the Great Barrier Reef. And I think that, Asa, we can actually probably get in close enough to see the pale blue colors are part of the reef. And the Great Barrier Reef is made up of a whole series of different reefs, and they sort of all come together. That material on the right-hand side of the screen those are the reefs it's just going off the edge of the screen on the right. And each of those little islands there is made up of reefs. And I have not yet been there, but someday I hope to get here and go snorkeling or diving on the Great Barrier Reef. And when you dive in the reefs, you see wonderful varieties of different kinds of fish, and there's all kinds of different colored corals, and it's a place where you can see many, many different kinds of marine animals. And the oceans are extremely valuable to us because they harbor so much life, and we fish in the oceans. We have lots of different techniques for getting fish out of the oceans, and in some cases, you can see what the reefs look like here with the NOAA film. And it's a beautiful place to go look at. You can see how many different kinds of fish live there. And it's a resource that we think of as being so huge and immense, but everybody goes fishing, and eventually we start to run out of fish. And so there are challenges with ocean management. And there's wonderful careers available for young people in marine biology and fisheries biology, where you can study fish and study the oceans and learn about the resources of the sea. And we have traditionally thought of the resources as being almost limitless, but they're not limitless. And as we put more and more fishing boats in the water, we start to use up the fish that are in the sea. And that's a challenge for us as a civilization. You know, these animals need to have their own environment. They need to be safe, and we need to keep it clean. There's been issues with plastic pollution. Some of you have heard about plastics getting into the ocean. That's a problem. And the issues with temperature of the water going up is a problem. And so as you guys study science and go through school, you should pay attention to the life of the creatures that live in the oceans, because they're fellows here on they're passengers with us on the planet Earth. And it's a wonderful ecosystem to study, and extremely productive, and lots and lots of different kinds of animals live underneath the sea surface, and every one of them is precious to us. And there's a high school in New York that's working on oysters, and oysters live in the sea, and the school is called the Harbor School in New York. It's on Governor's Island, and the students study oysters, and they've got a project to put 1 billion oysters into the New York Harbor. So students today are in school in New York studying the seas and learning how to grow oysters, and they're repopulating the New York Harbor with oysters, because the oysters had died out because they'd been all eaten up by hungry people, and the waters had become polluted. Now the waters are being cleaned up, and the oysters are coming back on the east coast of the United States. And some of you might know about plastic pollution, and there's plastic in the oceans. We've got to keep our plastic out of the oceans. And there's been a lot of questions about how much pollution is in the ocean, and can young people work to prevent that. And some places are banning plastic bags because the plastic gets into the oceans, and people are trying to clean up the ocean. Some of the islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean have lots of plastic on them. People are cleaning those up. And then young people are also picking up plastic on the beaches. And Kim, I don't know if that picture came through of Ocean Day, but this is a picture in California, and there's like 1,000 kids there. And this is a picture of a beach near Los Angeles. And there's 1,000 children, and they're all sitting in special places. They drew the feature on the sand, and then the kids are all sitting there, and they took the picture from an airplane. And it says, "Protect what you love." And it shows a young person putting garbage in a garbage can and the fish smiling. And these kids went down to the ocean and they picked up trash on Ocean Day. It happens once a year in California, and thousands of students get involved, and they go down to the sea and they collect every little bit of plastic they can find on the ocean, and they bring it in and they put it into plastic bags and take it to the dump. And that way they clean up the ocean for everybody else and for the animals that live there. So kids can do this. And you guys, as you grow up and study oceans and study the environment, you can help make it better. And you can help clean up plastic, you can help clean up pollution, and you can think about how to help the creatures in the sea survive. We'll have just the last couple of looks here. We're looking at Western United States, and some of you will recognize Baja California, and that's called the Sea of Cortez, which is the area between Baja California and Mexico. And that's where whales have their babies. It's a place that people go down. I have not seen this yet myself, but I've heard of people going down there certain times a year. The whales come in to the Sea of Cortez, and there's places where you can go and watch the whales swimming around with their babies down near Baja California. That's Cabo San Lucas at the bottom, for those of you who've been there. So we've traveled around. Let me just sort of think about what we've seen. We started out with the Pacific Ocean, and then we went and looked at the North and South Atlantic Oceans, and then we looked at the Mediterranean Sea, and then we thought about the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and then we looked at the Aral Sea, which is shrinking, and then we looked at the Red Sea, which is very symmetrical, and then we looked at the Dead Sea, where the water levels are falling. And these are just some of the seas. There's lots and lots of areas around the world that you guys can visit. And I certainly hope that all of you have a chance to visit the oceans and the chance to swim in the waters and see the animals that live in the sea. And we might have, let's see, Kim, do we have a picture of dolphins, one of those NOAA, just to sort of close out with some nice views of the creatures swimming in the sea. And I've been on boats, and you can sometimes see the dolphins playing behind the boats. I've seen dolphins playing behind boats, and they play in the wake. They're wonderful animals. See them jumping. They're having a great time. There you go. So we might see if there's anybody has questions. We can sort of get here towards the end of the program. If people have questions or want to have a specific place we can go any place on the surface of the world. Asa can take us anywhere using OpenSpace, which is this NASA program. So
we had a request for the Yucatan Peninsula.
Okay, let's go we'll look at the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, and we'll see if we can find the Yucatan Peninsula. So we're circling around again. So you can see China there up in the middle. Then this is the biggest ocean in the world. It's got Hawaii in the middle of it, and it begins with a P. So this is the Pacific, and you see how huge it is. It makes the world look like a blueberry. That's the whole world. And then we're coming across, you got North America up at the top, South America on the right, and then the Yucatan Peninsula. Do you guys know what a peninsula is? Peninsula means almost an island. Peninsula means almost island. And that's the Yucatan Peninsula right there in the middle, lower part of the screen. The big island on the right-hand side, it looks sort of like a long skinny thing. That's an island, begins with a C. That's Cuba. And the Yucatan Peninsula is made up of, it's south end of the Gulf of Mexico, and it's got what's really the Caribbean ocean or sea on the right-hand side. And the Yucatan Peninsula is part of Mexico. So now I see somebody wants to go to Dubai. So let's go, we're going to see if we can go to Dubai. And Dubai is in the Persian Gulf, which has also been called the Arabian Sea. And we're going to have to cross the Atlantic. You guys can help guide us. We're going to cross the Atlantic. We're going to try to find Dubai. Let's see if we can find Dubai. We're going right across the Bermuda Triangle, incidentally. Somebody's asking about it. We just crossed over the top of the Bermuda Triangle. We're coming back through the Straits of Gibraltar. Now we're crossing the Mediterranean. This is all familiar ground. You guys know this now. And look at this, we're coming down. We've got the Red Sea, which is our old friend there on the left. And on the right-hand side is what we call the Persian Gulf. And some of you wanted to see the Persian Gulf. And this is coming down to Dubai. Dubai is on the Persian Gulf, along with the United Arab Emirates and Qatar and Kuwait and parts of Saudi Arabia and parts of Iraq and parts of Iran. And this is called the Straits of Hormuz. Remember the word strait? We use it for Straits of Gibraltar. This is the Straits of Hormuz. And we're going to nip right down here to Dubai because there's some beautiful things to see here, which some of you might remember from previous shows. But we're coming right down into the United Arab Emirates, and this is Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And they've been building amazing things in the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Sea. And you'll see these beautiful structures being built here. And Asa is bringing us down right now into a little series of islands that have been built here. And see if you see the shape, what these islands look like. So here is a series of little islands, and these islands were made by man. They dredged the sand to make the little islands, and you should see a pattern. There you go. People are recognizing it. You see, it's the world. The islands are in the shape of the world. And you can buy one of those islands and build your house on it and sail your boat to it. And if you go to Google Earth, which you guys can do, you can use Google Earth at home. You can go and look at this place and you can zoom in and you'll see that they're building their homes on some of these little islands that are in the shape of the world.
And Bob, earlier when you were talking about volcanoes, someone said they learned in an earlier digital Earth program about the Ring of Fire.
Ah, yes. Well, so that's the Ring of Fire goes all the way around the Pacific Ocean. And we can slowly back out. We're going to leave the Persian Gulf. And it's an important thing to think about, the distribution of volcanoes around the surface of the Earth. And many of the world's volcanoes are located around the Pacific Ocean. And why is that? Let's think about that for a minute. Some of you might know why that is. So we're coming around, we'll see the Western Pacific. And we can use the Western Pacific as a place to show it here. So you can see that the Pacific Ocean is on the right, and actually the ocean crust is moving, and it's going down underneath those islands, which include Japan and parts of easternmost Russia. And the Pacific Ocean plate is going down and it melts. And as it melts, it makes volcanoes. So those of you who've studied a little bit about earth sciences might have heard the word subduction, but those are the deep sea trenches, and the ocean crust from the Pacific Ocean is subducting or going down underneath the land. And as it goes down, it melts. And we're coming into Kamchatka here. And Asa, if you go right into that peninsula at the top of the screen, you'll see some of the volcanoes that make up the Ring of Fire that goes all the way around the Pacific Ocean. And that's the deep sea trench. That's the dark ribbon. And the ocean crust is going down, and it's melting when it goes down, and it comes up in the form of volcanoes. And here we are in Kamchatka, which is easternmost Russia. And some of those not so little, but the mountains down there are all volcanoes. And there's some very big ones. which we might see if Asa's piloting us down in there. This is uncharted territory. We haven't really been here before, but I bet we're going to see some volcanoes. And yes, it does look like there might be some snow on it. A combination of snow and lava, and maybe even I might see some wispy, it might be erupting. I see a little bit of smoke coming out of that volcano. So this is part of the ring of fire around the Pacific Ocean, which would include the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, and then the Cascade volcanoes of northwestern United States, and then all the way down through Central America and down through South America in the Andes Mountains. But there you go, beautiful, Asa. Look at that beautiful volcano, 2 of them right there. So this is part of the ring of fire.
And a lot of people are wondering, we flew over the Bermuda Triangle, but people weren't sure what they were looking at. What is the Bermuda Triangle?
Well, while we're getting, let's go back and we'll see if we can find the Bermuda Triangle. It's the Bermuda Triangle is a little bit of a mysterious place, and you might have heard another term, the Sargasso Sea. And the Sargasso Sea and the Bermuda Triangle are areas that are relatively near Bermuda and off of the east coast of Florida, so off the eastern United States. And it's an area where ships sometimes would get wrecked by hurricanes. And back in the day when we didn't have good weather prediction and we didn't know the patterns of hurricanes very well, it's just to the east of Florida, the ships would enter into this area and they'd encounter a hurricane and they'd get sunk and they'd just disappear completely. And before we knew where hurricanes were going, it was a mysterious thing, and ships would have gone in and have been sunk by a hurricane and they'd never be heard from again. And so there's all kinds of mythology and lore amongst the sea captains about the dangers of the Bermuda Triangle and the dangers of the Sargasso Sea, which is in the same area. So it's right down there, but it's north of the Bahamas. That's Bermuda, that little island on the bottom of the screen. So this is the Bermuda Triangle right in here. North of Haiti and Santo Domingo, north of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica, and east of Florida, right in there.
Very cool.
So let's see, we had one last thing I see is somebody's asking for the English Channel. It might be our last view would be, we could go look at the English Channel, which is going to be part of the North Atlantic. And it's a fun place to look at. It's going to separate the British Isles from the mainland of Europe. So you guys can help guide us. We're going to be looking for the North Atlantic Ocean, and we're going to be pivoting around. You've got some islands covered in ice up there. One of them, a smaller one with a little bit less ice on it. And then you can see the British Isles. You can see Ireland and England. And then you can see France and Europe. And the English Channel is the little narrow body of water that separates Great Britain from France and Belgium and Netherlands. And you can see it's quite narrow in the narrowest place. And there's all kinds of interesting shipping problems in here because there's a huge amount of shipping traffic and they're putting in wind turbines. So interesting thing about the British Islands is that they're trying to generate more of their energy from wind, as is Denmark and France and the Netherlands. And they're putting in offshore wind turbines, which are giant propellers. And there's also a lot of boats moving around, and there's fishing and all kinds of things going on. So there's a lot of discussion and a lot of need for people to do work on energy and energy facilities. And how do you get the fish, the fisheries, the boats, and the wind turbines to all fit together? It's one of the big puzzles for people. And there's going to be lots of jobs for people who want to be marine biologists, marine engineers, people who work on studying the ocean and understanding how to live with the oceans. So,
all right. And right now it's been about 45 minutes. So we know some of you have other classes you need to get to. So if you need to leave, that's totally fine. Thank you so much for joining us. If you can stick around, we have another 10 or 15 minutes where we will continue to answer some of the questions that you put in the chat.
So thank you all for participating, and we're going to be continuing our program in the fall. So this is our last Digital Earth Academy for the spring, but we're going to continue in the fall. So as you guys come back to school in the fall, and hopefully we're all back in school in the fall, we'll hope that you'll join us for more Digital Earth Academy programs from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And thank you all very much for joining us today.
And for those of you who can stick around, we have some questions about life in the ocean. Can anything live near an underwater volcano?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And when I was a student, when I was in graduate school, after I finished college, I went to graduate school in California, and we studied the Atlantic Ocean. And we had information from the central part of the Atlantic Ocean, which is where there are a lot of volcanoes. And I was just a student in school, but I had colleagues who were on ships, and they were sending down cameras to the little volcanoes on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. And it was astonishing how many things were living down there. And they found all kinds of little things like crabs, and there's a kind of a worm, very strange worm. It lives in a tube. It's called a tube worm. And the tube worms live right near the volcanoes. In fact, they live in hot springs that are near the volcanoes. And Kim, I don't know if you're still with us with the video clips, but we did have a video clip of a hydrothermal system under the sea. Yeah, here. And this is an example of one of these hot springs under the water near the volcanoes. And there's all kinds of little critters that live down here. And we were astonished to discover this when I was a grad student. Some of those things on the lower right, there you go. You see those things? They're like little lobsters and crabs. You can see things are living down there in the super dark, super cold waters right next to the volcanoes. And there's a clam. Who would have thought? Look at that, a little lobster kind of guy. These are images from NOAA, courtesy of NOAA, and it's a fantastic thing to be able to see what's down below the surface of the water.
Amazing. Also, a question about life. Some people are very curious, are there still any megalodons?
Oh, so Carcharodon megalodon was the giant shark that lived in the oceans, and I think it's a Miocene shark, if I'm not mistaken. So the actual Carcharodon megalodon, I think, was a Miocene species, and the relatives of that shark definitely still exist. They're definitely still there, but whether that exact shark still swims, I don't know the answer. But I think not, because the teeth that were so famous, they're almost the size of my hand, those triangular teeth that you might have seen samples of, those are almost all fossilized. I don't know of modern ones, but that's a question that you could ask that to your Google and see what comes up. And I know I have seen examples of very large shark jaws in museums. There's one in the American Museum of Natural History in New York that's a modern, very large shark jaw. It's like the giant mouth of the shark, but the teeth are only, they're only about an inch or so big. They're not like 4 inches big, which is a megalodon tooth. But you could do some additional research yourself on that one.
So this is a very important question. One of our panelists heard that if you dive too deep in the ocean, your eyes will pop out of your head because of the pressure. Is that true?
Well, the question is, will they pop out or pop in? And we'd have to do some research on that. It's a little bit of a spooky question. What happens, of course, is as you dive into the ocean, the pressure builds up. It gets more and more pressure. And people can dive several hundred feet down but if you get further down than that, the pressure is too great and you can't survive. It'll crush you. And so the ocean is hospitable in the surface waters, meaning it's very nice to be there. But the deeper waters, we go down in submarines and we go down in bathyscaphs, which are pressure vessels that allow us to go down into the deep water. So I think you'd be very uncomfortable if you dive too deep into the ocean.
So use proper equipment if you're going deeper than a couple hundred feet.
Yeah.
So someone just asked, are there any animals that have not been discovered?
Well, the answer to that is always a difficult question to answer, but I am certain that there are many animals living in the oceans that we do not yet know about. And I can say that easily because the floors of the ocean are the least well-known parts of the surface of the entire Earth. And so periodically, every once in a while, fishermen dredge up or pull up a fish that they've never seen before. And those are the bigger things. Think about the smaller things, the little crustacea, the little things like crabs and lobsters. There are many, many, many undiscovered species on the floors of the ocean, and they're waiting for marine biologists and students like you guys to learn about them. They're waiting for you.
And it looks like for megalodons, it looks like there's no evidence of any megalodons living after the Pliocene era, which was a long, long time ago. Though they have shown up in some movies, but so this was a question way at the beginning. What causes waves in the oceans?
Well, so if you've been to the beach, and I've been to lots of oceans, and some oceans are very easy to get into. You just sort of mosey into the ocean, no problem. But there's oceans have monstrous waves on them, and the Pacific Ocean especially. I've seen huge waves in the Pacific. Which is curious because the name Pacific was given to it because it was supposed to be sort of a peaceful ocean, but it's got monstrous waves. And the waves happen in part because of the wind blowing the water towards the coast. And so as the wind is blowing the water towards the shore, the water actually is moving a little bit, and it develops waves, and the waves come as the water water depths get shallower and shallower. The waves crest and they break onto the beach. And there's a fantastic study of this, and the stronger the winds, the bigger the waves. And of course, the people that love the waves are the surfers, and the surfing people love to find the biggest waves, and they look at the storm patterns, and they can predict based on how the winds are blowing where the waves are going to be really big. And so surfers in Hawaii and surfers in California and surfers in South Africa are very attentive to the wind patterns so they can find the biggest waves.
Very cool. So I think we just have time for a couple more questions, one of which I looked up the answer to, so I'll just share with you. Someone asked how many shipwrecks are in the ocean? And it's estimated that since people started building boats, about 3 million ships have sunk in the ocean, and only about 1% of those have been explored. So there's lots of ships in the bottom of the ocean. And the related question for you, Bob, is people are really want to study the oceans, and how can they get into that?
Well, so if you want to study the oceans, there are a lot of different ways of doing it. And so the one of the things you want to do is you want to take some science classes. And if you're getting ready to go to high school, when you get to high school, you can take science classes in high school. And the science of the ocean, it's built on chemistry and physics. So you can take those kinds of classes, but it's also built on biology. And so marine biology, the study of the animals that live in the sea, is a wonderful topic. And there are many schools in the United States, colleges, in California, for example, and in the East Coast, and in Massachusetts, for example, and in Florida, where they study the oceans. And you can study the geology of the oceans. And I'm a geologist, so I love the geology of the oceans. But You can also study the water chemistry of the oceans, which is very important because the fish need to have good, clean water. You can also study the kinds of animals that live in the oceans. And there's a huge variety. You know, there are mammals that live in the oceans. There's fish that live in the oceans. And there's all kinds of crustaceans and invertebrates that live in the oceans. So I would recommend, if you're interested in studying oceans, that you take science classes, and then you can do a lot of reading on your own. And today, you can use the computer and you can look at YouTubes about the ocean. You can look up ocean things in Wikipedia. And there's a wide variety of places where you can find out information on oceans. And if you go to the library, your school library, they'll have books about the oceans. There'll be magazine articles about oceans, like in National Geographic, for example. And you can find out a lot about oceans just by a little bit of Googling. And I encourage you to do that. It's a wonderful topic, and we need a lot of studies for the oceans. They need people to work on them. They're waiting for you.
All right, wonderful. Well, that's about all the time that we have. Thank you once again, everyone, for joining us. This is our last one of the school year, but we'll be back in the fall with more Digital Earth Academy. So we'll keep in touch and keep an eye on our website.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Asa, Mitch. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Kachun. Thank everybody that helped behind the scenes. Thank you to Noah and to NASA.